الآن الكلام للأستاذ هانز سبونيك، فليتفضل.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start just with a word of thank you to Dr. Azmi Bishara for having taken this important initiative. I'm grateful to be here. I'm also grateful that Dr. Naji Sabri began to remind us that the war against Iraq didn't start in 2003. It started much earlier. It started on the 6th of August, 1990. 13 years of economic sanctions, the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever imposed against a country, were simply a war by other means, another kind of war. And if you look back, and I want to spend just a moment on this period, if you look back, you can see that the initial years of Iraqi suffering from 1990 to 1995, Iraqis were totally dependent on outside donations, small donations, inadequate donations. There was no contribution from the United Nations. It was just the international community that donated. The following years, from 1995 to 2003, saw the United Nations attempt to offer a humanitarian exemption, the Oil for Food program. I think it is very safe to now say that this program was not meant to work well. And sensitive as I am in following developments, I can also now say, also from the time I served in Baghdad, human rights, an immensely wrongly used term, did not play a role or much of a role in conducting international business, in conducting the work of the United Nations. And almost cynically, the conclusion was the people's suffering are just an unfortunate, a terrible word, collateral damage. And this lack of willingness to protect the Iraqi people, there was a huge, convenient, cruel, I would say, toolbox to facilitate this. One has to do with something in international relations which is not Iraq specific, but which has continued to damage all these efforts to resolve a crisis peacefully. And that is little known outside the inner circles of United Nations work, and that is, I'm referring here to consensus resolutions. These resolutions which become acceptable only because they are worded in such a way that we all can interpret the resolutions as we wish to interpret them. What does it mean if in Resolution 687, a very key resolution of 1991, the resolution refers to sanctions will be lifted if Iraq has collaborated in all respects? What does that mean? Collaborated in all respects. What does it mean if sanctions are ended? Another resolution, 1284, if Iraq has completed all actions expected. And a key resolution to which Dr. Naji Sabri also referred, Resolution 1441, if Iraq is in material breach, there will be serious consequences. I ask you, what does that mean, material breach? You would ask a French diplomat, a British diplomat, an American diplomat, and you would get 3 or 2 different answers and interpretations. So this was one convenient way of making life very, very difficult for the Iraqi people. The bureaucratization, I cannot go into detail, but the bureaucratization of this so-called humanitarian program, and let me pause here for a second and remind us, the humanitarian program of the United Nations was 100% financed with Iraqi money. My title as humanitarian coordinator in Baghdad, I was ashamed because there was nothing humanitarian. It was all Iraqi money that was used to implement the Oil for Food program. So the bureaucratization was another way of preventing a positive impact on the lives of the people. Blocking of items. You may not believe, but the figures are there. Over $5 billion, not million, $1 billion worth of supplies needed in Iraq were blocked in, for example, August 2002, a peak, but still a high level of preventing items by simply saying, no, they cannot come into the country, we will block these. And there were, doesn't make me anti-British, it doesn't make me anti-American when I say only 2 governments decided to do that. No other government in the Security Council Sanction Committee withheld items that were meant to make life easier in Iraq. The no-fly zones. The United Nations Security Council never sanctioned the no-fly zones. They were illegal. And they were used in the beginning, maybe innocently, to reassure Kurds and Shias that somewhere there were some powers that wanted to protect them. It was very clear that after Operation Desert Fox in 1998, this had all changed, and the no-fly zones were misused by 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council to destabilize Iraq. And if you want, I think it's not wrong to say it was also a way of preparing for what happened on the 19th of March 2003. Prevention of dialogue. As a UN official, I learned in my 32 years in the United Nations that dialogue was part of my toolkit, that we should do all we could to facilitate dialogue in order to solve or at least contain a conflict. And Dr. Naji Sabri, I'm sure I refer to him again, will remember when the government of Iraq put together a dossier of all the issues, the military, the economic, the humanitarian issues, in a pamphlet, and the response from Colin Powell was, when he was given this booklet in early 1999, I think it was, and he said, I don't need to look at it, I know what is in it. We know what they want. So there was no receptivity for dialogue. And one of the toughest obstacles in trying to make the world realize what was really happening in Iraq, well, was dis and misinformation that was all the time being channeled into the media. I think you have many examples. I just want to remind us, you are all well aware, many of you much better than I am, of what was happening. But the date 5 February 2003, the television cameras of the world were directed on Colin Powell as he presented his case against Iraq in the Security Council. And we know how dishonest this presentation and how fateful this presentation was for the destiny of Iraq. And the impact, well, the government of Iraq, by sanctions, was not forced out. On the contrary, the UN was unipolarized. It was dominated by one single member of the permanent five, the United States. And the Iraqi people were victimized. There are only two figures I want to present to you, but they are important figures to understand this whole trend towards an even deeper disaster as it evolved. 6.5 years of the Oil for Food program, 6.5 years. There were $43 billion, as reported by the UN, available, 43 billion. $28 billion were actually utilized. You can ask me later why the difference between 43 and 28. But no one, you will see no UN document which disaggregates these figures further to show what $28 billion of humanitarian supplies that arrived in Iraq really meant for the people. It translated into 51 cents per person per day. And we in the United Nations argued that 60 to 70% of the people in Iraq were dependent on this, on 51 cents. A dignified survival program, far from it. Then came the invasion and the occupation on the 19th of March 2003. We all know this. I cannot go into details, but I want to assure you that there were serious attempts to try and prevent this war. And I was involved in quite a direct way, I must say, in two of these attempts. One involved Nelson Mandela, Jimmy Carter, and Matti Ahtisaari, a colleague of mine before he became president of Finland, and the German Chancellor Schröder and the French President Chirac. All of these, in two different attempts, tried to prevent this war. Among other things, it failed because we in the West very often do not understand the culture of the countries and the continents with which we deal. Chirac and Schröder had made it a precondition to come to Baghdad and meet with Saddam Hussein only if there was a guarantee that the Kurds would have more autonomy, that there would be a non-aggression pact with the neighbors, and that human rights would be improved in Iraq. The government's response, I negotiated many, many hours with Mr. Tariq Aziz, and his response was, if someone comes to us as a state visitor, he is welcome to raise any issues, but we do not accept preconditions. So the invasion of 2003 was no big surprise. Important is that yet again, what was meant to be an enabling resolution was not an enabling, it was an enabling in a way resolution because it was a consensus resolution, material breach, serious consequences, and the way it was used. What is remarkable to me is that there was no protest from the United Nations Security Council when there was that illegal invasion by the US and the UK into Iraq. Worse, much worse, I would say, a few weeks, 2 months, in fact, after the invasion was over, in May 2003, the United Nations Security Council issued an invitation to member countries to contribute to the stability and security of Iraq. I respect that, thank you. And to contribute to the stability and security of Iraq by providing personnel, equipment, and other resources to the occupying powers. In other words, the UN Security Council, instead of protesting, it legitimized the invasion and the occupation. Well, I've just been told I must be shorter. I will try and jump a little bit and simply make my observations on the current picture that presents itself as of, if you wish, today. We can say for Iraq, as a result of this horrific application of wrong policies and wrongdoing, today we see ethnic tensions. We see sectarianism as a major element in all aspects of Iraqi life. We see, unfortunately, with few exceptions, maybe my neighbor, I can say the Guardian of the UK has been among the few who have referred to the targeted, deliberate killing of academics and professionals in Iraq. There are lists available to the Brussels Tribunal, for example, it's represented here, of over 1,000 professionals that have lost their life. I can go on through a long list ranging from the fact that Iraqis almost a quarter of Iraqis are poor today. 28% are unemployed. And to me, almost unbelievable, 14% of the Iraqis are orphans today. Orphans, most of which since 2003. There's drug abuse, there's corruption. I can go into details. And the conclusions, well, I would say dictatorship, war, sanctions, invasion, occupation, and there is today an enormous governance chaos, a broken nation that we witness. International law has been flouted, the UN has been paralyzed. I would say nothing about the Arab League, and I'm coming now very quickly to the end, because after all, this is meant to be an academic meeting, and I would say there is an enormous amount of research that needs to be done, where we don't have the full picture, and we must have the full pictures. I think we owe this to the Iraqi people, and we owe it also to intellectual honesty, that we are looking more carefully into a number of issues that are not clear yet. Just to mention a few, and then I will come to the end. I would say it is not at all clear yet what the role was of the UN Secretariat, the Secretary General, what the roles were of the government of Iraq, the Kurdish regional government, the Iraq National National Council, that is the opposition groups. What the role was, I could tell you hours about the involvement of intelligence agencies in my office in Baghdad. It's not clear yet. And politicians and scientists have shied away from looking at the impact of depleted uranium and white phosphorus. Of impact, we have a paper on the Compensation Commission. On the impact of UN oil oversight, a very, very tough decision. And I do not like to speak against colleagues. But Ambassador Butler and his work in the war, in the disarmament group of the United Nations is despicable and has to be looked at in great detail so that we know the full picture. Major topic, I would say, and that's really my last observation, a major topic that needs to be looked at by academic research is the question of what kind of war crimes and crimes of torture were performed during and after the invasion in Iraq. And there is, and that is, I want to end on a positive note, there is good progress after 7 years of hard work in Kuala Lumpur by Dr. Mohammed Mahathir. Whatever you may think about him politically, there is one unquestionable achievement, and that is we have evidence. We have interviewed, I'm a member of the War Crimes Commission on Iraq, and we have solid evidence by having interviewed with torture victims and other war crime from Abu Ghraib, from Camp Cropper, from Bagram, from Guantanamo, And this is now at a stage where, with help from outside, we want to transfer this knowledge, the scientifically assembled knowledge, from a court of conscience in Kuala Lumpur to an international court, normal legal court, and for that we have good support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightening contribution.